So we continue on in Deuteronomy today. We're going to be talking about Joshua, and so we're going through the previous books before the book of Joshua so we can get a little bit of context for how things are going in his life. And so, graduates, I want you to imagine yourself in Joshua's shoes. Imagine yourself being this upcoming young leader who was chosen by Moses, and Moses mentored him. Imagine yourself going with Moses as he goes throughout the wilderness, as he goes up the mountain. Joshua was there. He was one of the ones that were taken up the mountain. He was one of the ones that fought the very first battle, led the very first battle. If you remember the story where Moses and his Aaron, his brother, and he had to hold up his hands for the battle to win. Well, you'll have to go back and read it, and I hope you do this afternoon. But as that happened, Joshua was the warrior that was leading the army of Israel in that battle. And so Joshua went step by step by step. He was everywhere with Moses. And so today's young leaders need mentoring. And you are their mentors. So when Moses appointed 12 scouts to spy out the land, Joshua was one of those scouts. He returned with great enthusiasm. And you had all these scouts who were naysayers saying, it's terrible, they're giants, we can never do this, it's awful. And Joshua said, it's a wonderful land. And the Lord, if he wants to, he's going to give it to us. And we need to go in and go get it. And that was a positive, venturesome spirit that Joshua displayed as he was being mentored through the process with Moses. So, young people, are you looking for someone to mentor you? Do you have a mentor? It's not necessarily your parent, probably isn't your parent because they've been mentoring you all along, but someone else that comes alongside you, that works with you, that teaches you, that encourages you, that sometimes tells you the truth. Well, Moses had taken Israel out of Egypt. Moses had been with them through this whole time as they were coming out of slavery and gone through the wilderness and all of that. And he comes to the edge of the Jordan River. And then he learns he's not going to take them in. Joshua has been beside him all this time, and Joshua is the one that is chosen to go in to the land, take them in. Now, when they were in the wilderness, and Joshua was with Moses, and when they were in the wilderness, they had a lot of stumbling blocks, a lot of things that they were weak in. The people were weak in learning how to walk by faith. And so daily, God taught them, God tested them, God kind of taught them again and tested them again until God, through Moses, established a lifestyle that they were able to go into the promised land. But it took quite some time to train them, and the people didn't have any idea of the principles they needed to live with once they went into the land. And so Moses had to do that. They needed to live successfully in a relationship with the Lord. And so Moses had received the law on Mount Sinai. They didn't get 1,000 copies or 600,000 copies. So Moses had to tell it to them, to explain the law to them, and establish a lifestyle of them learning to listen, learning to lean on God. Following God takes persistent faith and obedience. Now, this seems to be a little bit of an understatement, doesn't it? There's no way around it. To gain God's approval, you have to have faith. You have to obey. Obey. So we don't automatically come to either one of those principles. It doesn't happen by itself, for this world is Satan's territory. You find in the world, it's just like the territory that Israel was going into. There were nations there. They were enemies of God's. They were enemies of Israel's. There were lawless people there. They didn't want Israel to become a nation, so there was opposition, and Israel would have to fight for this land. They had to uproot the enemy. They had to become established themselves. They had to take possession of that land. Now, you heard the story from Angel. So I hope you're good with that. I can reread it to you if you need me to. But Moses was 120. It wasn't that he was, well, it probably was, he was a little exhausted. They say he was in great shape. But Joshua was younger. Joshua was that next generation coming in. And the Lord himself promised that he would cross over ahead of them. So what do you need to establish a nation? Why is the land so important? Have you ever wondered why God said, I'm going to bless you and I'm going to give you land? Why is that important? Well, it was very important to God because God was going to eventually bless all the nations of the world through Abraham, through the people of Israel, through all of y'all. And God had to establish Israel, whom God had chosen to work with. He had chosen this people, and he was going to establish them. Syncretism must not happen. They could not go into that land and just assimilate with all the people that were there. That would not accomplish anything. Their unique faith had to have a place to flourish, to grow, to be shaped. It would be lost if they syncretized with all these other nations. It had all these other beliefs around them. If they only half lived in their faith and half lived with these other people and their beliefs. And so they would be sucked up by the other people that were already established there if they came in, and that was the way it was. God's efforts would be lost. And so God wanted to give them land for several reasons. One of the reasons was they needed a place to live. They needed a place to establish worship. They needed a place to develop material prosperity. That would happen through the land because it was agriculture, and they would plant and build and grow, and they would establish prosperity through the land. They would also learn to treat each other properly. As they were following these laws, these 10 commandments of God, they would learn how to relate to each other, how to love others through God's vision, the commands of God. And so it's God's will that you have all these things. It's God's will that you have a place. It's also God's will that you take part in possessing the land. It is not something that's just plopped on you. You have a part in that happening, in establishing these things. So when the children of Israel moved forward and they're going to gain the land, there were things they were given, promises, gaining the promises, but also the land had responsibilities. So it's a two-part deal, promises and a responsibility. They had to live by the commands as they established themselves in the land. So what are they? They had to love the Lord, right? Love the Lord your God and no other God. They had to have no idols. They had to not worship anything else but God. They had to keep the Sabbath. They had to have a wife, and this, of course, is written to the men, and they had to, well, first respect their parents and then be faithful to the wife that they had, and then they had to treat their neighbor as himself. And they had to not commit adultery with their neighbor's wife. And then they had to not steal from their neighbor or not covet his property or lie about him. And these are all the responsibilities that they had. They could not be greedy. And that's how they were told to live. And so they needed to go into this land to live that way. And if they would follow these plans, they would have provision. They would have prosperity. They would have protection. And so you may see that that's where some of those ideas that we hear out there by churches, you know, people say, well, the prosperity gospel is wrong. Well, if it's the only gospel, it is, but it's part of the gospel. It's part of the gospel. Protection is part of it. Provision is part of it, of a place to live. And so when you center yourself in God's promises and ways, you have these things. You have these promises. That's what this is all about, going in and claiming or receiving the promises. But you also have responsibility. God was ready to bless them. They're on the edge. He was ready to bless them with the land. The people were ready to enter. Moses would step aside. Your upcoming young person is going to take his place. Are you ready? Are you ready? That's what we're helping them be, is ready. And we've got to help them be. It's not somebody else's responsibility. It's ours. You're the new commander who gets to take the people in to gain the gift. And so just like today, you young people are graduating. You have a future ahead of you. You're facing this rite of passage, which leads into a whole new role. So how do you face it? With faith and with obedience. With faith and obedience. Joshua would build on a foundation that he already had. It's a foundation that you can't ignore. It's a foundation that Moses had given him. It was established by God and lived out by Moses. And so we build on that foundation too. So if you don't have a mentor, go read and let Moses be your mentor. Or Paul. Or Peter. Or John in the Bible. Or just keep asking these folks out here to mentor you, because they have lots of wisdom. Now the Bible says this about Joshua. This is his identity. He unreservedly follows the Lord. Joshua unreservedly follows the Lord. Now, can you kind of keep that in your head as maybe a goal for you? And so who is God? How does this passage define him? Here it is. He's the go ahead of you God. He's the fight for you God. The win the battle God. The never fail you God. The never abandon you God. Is that your vision of God? It's right there in Deuteronomy 31. Let's say it again. Let's say it together. The go ahead of you God. The fight for you God. The win the battle God. The never fail you God. The never abandon you God. Does it say in there you won't have trouble? There's got to be a battle, right? There's got to be a battle if there's a fight the battle for you God. Okay, so we need to not get mixed up about that. Because if you think that everything's going to go smoothly and that that's a sign of God's blessing, that is not necessarily the case. There are times when things go drastically wrong, and you can't see the way out. That's when he's a go ahead of you God. That's when he's the fight for you God and the win the battle God. These are amazing commitments. Can we get our vision around that and see God in that light? Operating in that kind of faith is what will help us. When we believe God is on our side, no matter what we face, he's not only on our side, he's on our side in a really big way, a powerful way, and that kind of faith affects your life. But if you're going to syncretize with the culture, you're not going to have that kind of faith. You'll have weak faith. You won't see God as all-powerful. You will limp along, always wondering when God's going to come through for you. You will not exercise the power of God because you think God needs help. So he needs help by like what the culture says is right. And God needs to understand that. And you'll start trying to diminish your faith. You'll think that it doesn't matter that you compromise. Well, it's okay this time for what I want to do. And then that will, again, diminish God's power. Do you understand that Satan works through culture all the time to break down your faith? So if you're going to syncretize with the culture around you, you will not submit to God obediently. You'll put up a wall there. You won't accept God's authority as your leader. You know, it's the commander that goes forward in the fight. It's the commander that's out front. And the commander, God, is out front. Somebody's got to be behind, following. And here's the reassurance. You're not by yourself. You're not by yourself. When you're young, I mean, you're graduating, you're going through this rite of passage. That doesn't mean that you're gone from everything behind you. That doesn't mean that you're gone from your parents, or you're gone from your friends, or you're gone from your church body. You have that. And you have the foundation that's been laid over the course of the years. And you have other people. And so young people, you've been told about your gift. Can you take it out, please? Take your gift out of your bag. And then somebody shout it out, what it says.
Fear not, for I am with you.
Fear not, for I am with you. Now, you know what? I had no idea what that said when I wrote this sermon. Isn't God good? He's powerful. Fear not, because the Lord himself, the Lord will go ahead of you. Fear not, graduates. The Lord will go ahead of you. Everything that he brings to you will have meaning and purpose when you turn to him. So be strong, be bold. Rely on each other. Look for your mentor. Have no fear or dread of the people you must conquer. Now that seems like, well, how do we mesh that with what we do? Because we're not really going out. There's one in this room who has gone out. She hasn't really been in war, but she is in the Navy. And so she has gone out as if in battle. But the battle most of us face is more in the sense of there's people out there who are faithless, who've lost their faith. And so you're going to stand strong in faith, even though maybe a whole group of people in your college or your company or your experience are not standing in faith, and it might ridicule you or might come against you. And so you do have to approach them not with worldly wisdom, not with political strategy. You have to approach them with the Lord going before you. Approach them as if someone that God wants to open their eyes, bring light to. You are the one. And so you have to let God lead you. And Jesus said, he will give you the words as you go forth. You'll have major opportunities to influence your company or your school or whatever vein. If you're going to go be a filmmaker, you are going to have major opportunities to influence the nation and people if you succeed at that. And to have, you're going to influence people who've forgotten what it means to live by faith. And lots of people are out there who have forgotten how to live by faith, how to see God. And so you bring God to them. That is your job. That is your orders, your marching orders. You're going to teach people how to worship God, how to follow God's commands, how to walk in hope, how to get up after something has come against them and get up and move forward again in a positive way. Look around you, young people. Find an older person in this room. Go ask them. If they say no, you come tell me. You enter into the promises of God at God's invitation. I just was going to tell you, it came to me, I have a mentor who is 80 years old and another one who's 83. They're great. But you enter into the promises of God at God's invitation. God willingly goes before you. God is invested in you. He's the commander. Are you following him? Following the leader. That is your job. You are not in it alone. You've been given authority by a higher commander. This commander is perfectly capable to enable you to move forward successfully, to direct you into what he has called you to do. He set the command in your hands. Are you giving him yourself back to him? I promise you, if you do, you're going to gain the land. Amen.